My name is Leon Trilling, and together with my friend and colleague Wes Harris, we perpetrated this affair on you. To give you some context and tell you where this particular session fits with the set of 4 that we have, our general notion is that diversity is a given, inherent in the human race, and it is a source of great creativity. On the other hand, it is the excuse for a certain amount of disorder, and therefore one needs to pay attention to the social order in which the diversity expresses itself. Last week, we tried to show some of the fruits of diversity in the arts, in the visual arts, in the design of the public spaces in which we live, and in music. And we discovered that diversity is a great source of strength, of richness in the culture. But diversity is also a source of strife. It's an excuse for the use of force sometimes. And in the absence of a legitimate agent of conflict resolution, it may lead to difficulties. For a long time, the one consequence of diversity was the state of affairs described by Thucydides when he quoted the Athenian ambassador in Melos, who were unwilling to provide the money that the Athenians needed in their war. The Athenians told the Melans, the strong take what they want, the weak suffer what they must. And for a long time that was the handicap under which diversity was being lived. With the improvements in communication, in transportation, and in the tools of power, which really means the tools of destruction, the situation became more critical. There was a wider range of diversity. There was a closer symbiosis among the various diverse groups, and the human cost of conflict was greater. By the time of World War II, this state of anarchy was no longer tolerable. So how is diversity protected? That is what we are going to think about in the session tonight and in the next 2 sessions. On what principle does one protect diversity? On the world stage, I would propose that there is a principle of self-determination, and there is the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, which was voted by the United Nations, I think, in 1948. And the encouragement of diversity may be seen in a way in the process of decolonization, which began in a somewhat sham-like manner, but may be becoming more real, and Professor Choucri will tell us about that. Diversity manifests itself by giving value to various local diverse cultures within globalization. And Jeff Grossbeck will tell us of his experience in that respect. But I said something about an agent of conflict resolution. On the world stage, the attempt has been to have the United Nations primarily and some other international organizations play that role and act to some degree as an agent of enforcement of respect of diversity. And Joanne Mariner will tell us about that. This is what happens on the world stage. Next week, we will talk about how diversity is protected in the US. And it seems to me that the principle there is the invention of citizenship and the pursuit of citizenship by African American community, the Asian American community, the Hispanic American community, and the Native American community, with great effort and close to complete success. But the other aspect of it is that you have not fully protected diversity until the various components of the society have learned mutually to accept and respect each other. Hopefully this is beginning. Finally, on March 17, we will see how diversity is encouraged and protected right here at MIT. After all, this is MIT's 150th birthday. And I propose that the key issue here is a broadening of the notion of intellectual quality. MIT has always prided itself on its great respect, on its pursuit of intellectual quality, and it was the gradual broadening of the definition of intellectual quality from background to native ability, which marks MIT's way to accepting diversity, and MIT does it by changing the standards of admission, by providing a support structure for able people who are not ready for the rigors of MIT, and finally, by coping with the tension between diversity and what some in the faculty call intellectual quality. Well, that is the general context of what we are proposing to do. Today we talk about diversity on the world stage, and it is my privilege to introduce our chair, who is Professor Bishwapriya Sanyal. It's easier to say Bish Sanyal. I asked him how I should introduce him, and he said, introduce me as Ford International Professor of Development Planning, Director of MIT's SPURS program, the Hubert Humphrey Program for Mid-Career Professionals from Developing Country. And he adds, I was department head of the Department of Urban Studies and Planning from 1994 to 2002, and chair of the MIT faculty from 2007 to 2009. But that is only the beginning of it. Bish was an advisor to the World Bank. He has recently been elected one of the 6 MacVicar Fellows, a particular reward for those of us on the faculty who are deemed to be particularly good at teaching and at interacting with the students. And I've had the privilege of interacting with him somewhat in the International House program and have always marveled at how encouraging, how forthcoming, how thoughtful and constructive he is, and how well he interacts with the students. I'm sure he interacts just as well with the adults. And I give you Professor Sanyal, who will introduce the other members of the panel.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you. I want to thank Leon and also Wes Harris, who's in the audience, for organizing this session. I think it's very important. I mean, when both Wes and Leon asked me to chair this session, what I thought it is about is MIT at this particular moment, historical moment, is also looking outside in the real world about how diversity, the issues of diversity and differences are being addressed. And we want to learn as an institution from outside the world. And so that this conversation that we are having this evening hopefully will help us to move towards a more sophisticated understanding of diversity. What I want to do is to share with you a little bit, before I introduce the speakers, my thoughts on the subject, because I have been writing a little bit on why we emphasize differences among the people of the world as opposed to the similarities between them. And what struck me as I thought through this issue was, if you start with just after Second World War, and Nazli, who knows a lot about this period, is going to talk about it, but after right after Second World War, when countries came out of colonial rule, colonialism was based on the notion of difference, that some countries are superior, more superior than others, people of the world, certain parts of the world. So when colonialism lost, we tried to understand that the kind of equality among the people of the world, that was very important. And United States played a big role because it didn't have colonies at that time. And so if you look at Harry Truman's speech, et cetera, this very interesting speech about the world and what the role the United States is going to play. It was also interesting, I think, about right after Second World War, the Holocaust and the impact of the Holocaust on how we think about equality of people of the world. The Holocaust really, and that's something that Eleanor Roosevelt took into account in the Declaration of Human Rights, saying nobody in the world no human being should be subjected to this kind of treatment in the world. So if you look at the right after Second World War, and when we thought about how to develop these countries around the world, and that's the thing I work on, there were some economic theories, and there were some political theories, and there were social theories about how these countries that are coming out of colonial rule are going to develop. And I won't go into details of that, but what I want to emphasize is that in thinking about economic growth, how these countries are going to grow, we thought, and many still think, that they are going to go through the same process of industrialization, urbanization, agricultural modernization, consumption, and that's the trajectory of development. And of course, there are different resources, but the process is more or less same in terms of economic development. We also thought political development would be very similar at that time. So many of these countries, had tribal groups, particularly in Africa. So after colonialism left, should I use this microphone? Am I using it? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. So anyway, the issue was that political development would be similar to Western-style democracies. And the idea was that these countries which came out of tribal rules would follow in a way the party politics and the Western-style democracy elections, and yes, there will be difficult times, but ultimately they'll become democratic. Socially too, if you look at the literature, Talcott Parson, and very interesting amount of work, Max Weber, interesting work about how people are going to change. They'll become very rational people who use their time in a rational way. So the whole thing was that the world is very similar. Actually, people are very similar. If you give them the resources and the training, etc., they will pretty much follow a similar route. Now, the Cold War which creates another kink to the story. Of course, the Soviet Union had its own version of how the world should be and how people are. And then the Western camp was also in its own way a view about how people are. And there's a difference in that. But they both argued that ultimately the world will be similar. So capitalism and Western-style democracy argued that freedom is inherently human feeling. Everybody in the world will, and this is back to Egypt now. This conversation is coming back now. And Soviet Union thought, well, everybody in the world is very interested in equality and class equality, and ultimately human beings are going to be all equal, and they'll fight for it. So what strikes me is that this idea of similarity of people around the world, it began to change by 70s. And this is where United States also comes in, that kind of rise of multiculturalism, civil rights movement, to basically question this assumption that people are similar. And it came in a very interesting way in the developing world, because economically, many countries in developing world that had done pretty well, actually in the 50s and the 60s, all of a sudden the economies were collapsing, including the ones that were doing very well before, like Brazil. So people started questioning the economic framework, and then the cities, of course, there's slums, there's unemployment, et cetera. So people start thinking, maybe the framework that we thought we were going to use is not exactly working. Maybe people are different. Politically, by 1973, only 3 countries in Latin America were democratic. Every one of them had turned into authoritarian regimes. So the relationship between economic systems and political systems, between capitalism and Western-style democracy, that they go hand in hand, began to be questioned very seriously. Socially also, many of these anthropologists who came back after 20 years or 25 years of work abroad essentially said, what are we doing there? The people are different. Why are we imposing our views on these people? They think differently. Their rationality is different. Don't try to impose this hegemonic view on this world. All of a sudden, difference became more pronounced, that the places are different, people are different, the views have to be different, the theories have to be different. And so you have like almost 15 to 20 years of work on difference, glorifying difference over similarity. Then you had the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that sparked a new phase saying, no, this capitalism is the way to go. Actually, we are getting enough signifiers around the world that the world is very similar. Socialism and this communism won't work. And if you see Francis Fukuyama's work, The End of History, it was a major turning point saying the world will be all together. It's a market economy and democracy. That's what we're going to do. The twist to the story came with 9/11. And before 9/11, I would say with Samuel Huntington's work on Clash of Civilizations. And Clash of Civilizations is a book that really made us feel that the world, that we are not similar. We have very different civilizations, and we have to fight it out. And right after Huntington's work came 9/11, which made people feel maybe that is true. Maybe the world is so different. Maybe there are different groups of people. So we had 4 turning points, and now, just so happens, this 2 weeks back, we have this uprising in Middle East, which has now brought us back to the idea, or maybe the whole world is similar. And if you heard Barack Obama's speech, Barack Obama basically said, everybody in the world cares about freedom. Every human being cares about trying to be free and open and autonomous, and we cannot stop this. So we are back to this idea that somehow there are universal principles that kind of combine us as human beings. So I am very struck by this kind of swing in the way we explain similarity and difference. And I'm hoping that in our conversation this evening, we'll be able to keep that as a background. So without adding more, let me introduce Nazli Choucri, Professor Nazli Choucri, my colleague, actually in the Department of Political Science, has been at MIT longer than I am, right, Nazli?
Forever.
And she's now the Associate Director of the MIT Technology and Development Program, and also head of the Middle East Program at MIT. Her current research interests focus on innovations in global knowledge networking and implications for the global economy. She's also the founding editor of MIT Press series on Global Environmental Accord and the formal general editor of the International Political Science Review, which is a very prestigious publication. Nazli, on top of writing many things, is also currently serving her second term as the chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Management of Transformation Program for UNESCO, and also an elected member of the European Academy of Science. We are really happy that you could join us.
Thank you.
So please.
Great. Thank you, Bish. Listening to Bish's introduction, it occurs to me that what he sees as a swing, I see more of a paradox, and it's a paradox that we are living with today. The paradox is this: we have a quest for diversity that is supported by commonality and by cohesion. We have a expression of local values that are supported by global norms now. And we have the power of diversity that is reinforced by a demand for inclusion in political processes, not exclusion. So we have forces that are pushing in various directions. I call this a paradox because seemingly contradictory factors are really reinforcing the appreciation for diversity. So this is by way of overview. But the bottom line is that there's a major contentions between state and society, between the powerful and the less powerful, that converges around this diversity, this matter of the management of diversity. What I'd like to do is to share with you the roots of this paradox today that are tied to the colonization process, the decolonization process, and then argue that maybe what we see today in the Middle East and in other areas of the world is either the tail end of decolonization or the emergence of a serious democratization. I don't know which way we should consider this. But let me start with the roots of the concern for diversity and the management of diversity after World War II. The interesting thing about well, I will use the Middle East first and then move around different parts of the world. The important thing here is that the colonizers themselves had different strategies, different principles, and different objectives in the process of colonization, and certainly different tools. For example, the British controlled their colonies by virtue of controlling their leaders. The French went through a strategy of homogenization, trying to imbue the colonies with the French culture, the French language, and make them essentially Frenchmen. Other colonizers had other strategies, but fostering diversity was not one of them. Now, in the United States, by way of background, the westward expansion brought the colonizers in control, in contact with others. But that process became a state building and a nation building process, not a colonization process the way we understand it. And the reason I bring this up now is that I would like you to keep in mind the sharp contrast between historical experience in the United States and the colonization and decolonization of Britain and France and other countries. Let's move to the decolonization process. And here I want to draw your attention to three phases that help explain where we are at now. The first phase after independence, after decolonization, after World War II, was creating new states. And we have many stories about different capitals in the West taking the pencil or whatever it is and partitioning pieces of the globe. They did that after World War I, and then after World War II, a little arrangements here. Remember that after World War II, between 1945 and 1948, 49, 50, we saw an explosion of sovereign states. And now we have a first major challenge, and that is how to deal with sovereign states, not colonies, when it came to facilitating transitions into the international community. And at that point, the issue of identity, the identity of the state, of the people in the state, was really made by fiat. made by fiat by their leaders and to some extent by the international community as well. And that process suppressed diversity. The new states needed a national identity. That's phase one, creating new states. Phase two, that in some way Bish referred to, is the state building stage, where replicating the policies and the patterns and the norms of the colonizers was the driving motivation. To be fair, they didn't have much alternative experience. Also, to be fair, the international community as a whole was trying to facilitate the entry of new states into the system. The focus was on building the apparatus of the state. Every state needs a bureaucracy, it needs an army, it needs this, that, and the other, and above all, it needs statehood. And diversity in this context is a liability. It is not an asset. And in phase two, which is the state building phase, the focus was on growth. And Bish alluded to that also. The growth model in general, the traditional growth model, the textbook case, does not really support local communities. It doesn't talk to diversity. And it is not particularly concerned about the damages to traditional societies of the growth strategy. And all of this contributed to the suppression of diversity as a value, but also diversity as a form of political expression. Now, there were two really important impacts of phase two here. The first is growing cleavages between the state and its apparatus and society. And I take that as a generalization across the board. And the state dominates, society and community are a residual. The state controls resources, it distributes them as it wishes. And this arrangement was reinforced by international influences. Bottom line here is that it became clear that the state itself was having trouble managing its diversity. Now, the second important aspect of phase two, the state building phase, is that the structure that was put in place after World War II for different states mattered a lot. And this was a structure that came from the top, which might explain the fragility of some of the systems that we see today. The third phase, this is the phase of the decolonization that leads us to the diversity issue challenges today, is the trial and error that many of those countries went through politically, in terms of the search for a viable political, I can say ideology, although I really don't like that word very much. But if you consider that word from World War II to the present time, there was a lot of, is communism our path? Is capitalism our path? Socialism maybe? And then back again to, well, Marxism is a better form of communism, or maybe the revival of capitalism. And all this ended up with none of the above, and somehow we must do it our own way. The only problem is that most of those societies had no historical learning, precedents for fighting out how to do it their own way, in large part because of the colonization process, and in large part because before the modern colonization process, there were previous colonization attempts, and the region that we'll come back to today, the Middle East, is a very good one. Now, let's move on to the other side, if I have a few more minutes.
Yes.
The global dynamics. The global dynamics, things that were going on that really were not controlled by the colonizers or the decolonizers, or had nothing to do with immediate diversity then, but are very powerful over time. Call them multiplier effects, multiplier variables. The growth in education, the growth in globalization, the growth in communication, the growth in the youth segment, expansion of information networks, the cyberspace effect, all of this contribute to the individual having a voice. Now, in the last 10, 15 minutes, I never once mentioned the individual, because the individual, for all practical purposes, didn't exist. I mentioned state, I mentioned society, I may have mentioned community, but it's only now that individual becomes a relevant element. And that is really a new factor in world politics as a whole. Here in the United States, we may not consider that terrifically important because individuals do matter here, but in the dynamics that I'm talking about is really very important. Another aspect of the global dynamics that begin to have an impact as we move to the present time and to the management of diversity now is the subtle replacement of growth as the dominant economic paradigm to the quest for something that is framed as sustainability, the sustainability of our community, of our society, etc. So growth per se became somewhat moderated, and with the introduction of sustainability as a concept came the notion of sustainability of whom? And there we have the diversity element coming in, that the sustainability of the diversity within the society. Now, just a small digression here that is quite important. I can call it a digression or full circle or feedback dynamics, but let us look at the consequences of decolonization for the former colonizing powers of Europe. The large-scale migration from North Africa, from other parts of the world to Europe, first for the reconstruction of Europe after World War II, and as you see the demographic dynamics operate over time, Europe today ends up with two important demographic characteristics that bear directly on the issue of diversity. Large number of non-European, although by now they are European, individual fractions of population, and a very, very aging population relative to the rest of the world. So in a way, Europe is hostage to a form of diversity that is now indigenous and endogenous. And the political systems and the societies are having difficulties managing that. Now, unlike the United States, there's no social contract that is robust enough and no legal mechanisms that are really socially acceptable and robust enough to process and accept and indigenize this diversity. I've finished the digression. I go back to global norms. Let's take stock of what we now have as global norms, because we're talking about diversity and global norms combining together. Some of the norms we've talked about earlier. Professor Trilling mentioned human rights. Now we have the possibility that the state rights are not always the dominant right. This is new. We have participation as being an important element, representation, the salience of civil society. I haven't mentioned civil society yet, first time. And important here is that society matters. And then the final issue that is emerging that is quite important is that stability with repression is really no good. It's a new package of norms, a new package of ideas. Now, this, let me then conclude with, brings us back to the following proposition, that this paradox between diversity and commonality, local norms and global norms, etc., has become the new normal. And we see in the regions, let's say in the Middle East today, some convergence between local demands, indigenous local demands, and global norms and local norms. And the entity that is really having trouble adapting is not so much society, but the state and its apparatus. And the state today is on the defensive. I make that as a generalization. Now, to conclude, back to the Middle East today with the question of, is this the last phase of decolonization or the first phase of true democratization? A reminder of a few things. One, it's youth-driven. So far, it's communication-enabled. Expression of participatory norms. It's remarkably, so far, it has been unbelievably non-ideological. It's not the socialists against the communists against this, that. It's an internal process. And when I say an internal process, it means that it's socially driven, not externally motivated. We also see in the region today differences in which the state has responded and is beginning to respond. And we're now left with really the final question. How will these countries, with their own diversity, because they're a very diverse set of countries, begin to design their own alternative futures? This is a case where nobody but themselves is going to be allowed to manage the design for their future. So that's about as far as I want to take it.
Thank you, Nazli. Thank you. I think we should hold the questions. Maybe you hear the three speakers, and then we can open up for floor. So the next speaker is Jeffrey Grosbeck, and Jeffrey is a Legatum Fellow at the Legatum Center. I don't know how many of you know, but this is a new center that's doing very interesting work on development and entrepreneurship. And he's worked extensively in Latin America, particularly Bolivia and Mexico. He was executive director of the International Affairs. And currently he directs the La Vaqueta initiative, and that's one of the most ambitious development efforts undertaken at MIT. He's an expert and author on the history and socioeconomic development of Jesuit missions of Chicutas. So, Jeffrey.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'm going to start over here on the podium. I'm a little bit more on the old school side, and it's easier to navigate the presentation. I should also preface my comments with three comments. One, I'm not going to speak to the notion of Mexico tonight. The reason for that is that two groups from MIT have just returned from Mexico, one being iHouse, the other one being the Global Poverty Initiative, and they've achieved some stunning results that I think are probably better disclosed in a different forum. So sometime perhaps in late March or early April, we'll talk more about Mexico. For tonight, however, I shall confine my comments to Bolivia. The second caveat is that I am not in any way opposed to standard or traditional development norms, nor do I want to give the impression that I am. I'm simply offering some commentary which is largely based upon a consensus at this point. So I hope if I say something that you find perhaps a bit off the norm where development paradigms are concerned, that this is something that's actually quite common in Latin America now. There's quite a bit of people who've adopted this approach. The third comment is I'm trying to confine my comments here to a very large project. It actually took place over 35 years. My involvement in it was in and out. At one time I was leading various aspects of it. At other points I was a consultant, and so on and so on. It is true I have other initiatives, past and present, in Latin America. I don't think it would be particularly objective if I tried to deliver this presentation by talking about solely what I've been doing there. So instead I'm going to take you to Bolivia, and I'm going to pick up on Nazli's comments about the paradox there. And hopefully by taking the lens and narrowing it, we can see what's going on in some of these communities, in particular the 6 that I'm going to refer to in this presentation. So the traditional development efforts in Latin America, but also elsewhere, have by now been criticized roundly for what most people see as failures on 3 parts. And these 3 parts tend to contribute to a dependency motif. One of them, obviously, is that there's too much unilateral aid inflow. I don't think there's any dispute about that. If you read the numbers, it's quite convincing. The other one is that there's too complex technology transfer, which is a more recent criticism, but becomes apparent when one looks at the scale of some development projects, the resources that they require, balance that against what these countries generally have, and there's a huge disparity there. It's almost impossible to imagine that in a small town like Bolivia, a small town in Bolivia, one could bring in the necessary technologies to ramp it up to the point where the development agency says, this is fine, it now replicates what we in our own minds think it should have. And the third one is that there are too many long-distance policy decisions being taken and not enough listening to on-the-ground practitioner realities. I come from a practitioner environment. I think that of the 3, this is perhaps the most important, because these decisions are not being formed, these policies are not being formed by decisions taken on the ground. They're being formed primarily within the Beltway and other major areas where people look at things in terms of dollars and cents, much less so in terms of diversity and stakeholder interest. There is, however, a 4th issue that I find, although it has been more often looked, it is finally now coming to the fore It actually started in Ecuador in the 80s, and then in Mexico in the early 90s it became very important. The notion that there's a too monolithic understanding of who the stakeholders are. In fact, this goes very much to the notion of not understanding the inherent diversity in most of these communities. And the fact that if you attempt to change a community and take the diversity out of it and make it a more homogeneous unit, you're really not doing anyone any favors, and you're actually probably doing the worst thing you possibly could do. So the question then becomes, how do you work within the context of keeping the diversity there, which is very much the life flow, as it were, of these communities. It informs their culture, it informs their everything about them, and yet at the same time do some good in collaboration with those people. So I'm now going to show you, these are the 6 missions, the ex-Jesuit missions in Chiquitos, which is otherwise known as the Chiquitanía, which is a region in eastern Bolivia. There are more than 6 missions. What's important to keep in mind here is that only 6 were chosen for this development effort, and you'll see at the very end why that is so important. One of them, in the first mission, founded in 1691, San Javier. The second one is San Rafael de Velasco, followed by San Jose de Chiquitos, and then we have Concepcion, followed by Santa Ana de Velasco, and the last one, San Miguel de Velasco. They're all very beautiful, as you can see. They're all quite pristine, at least from a visual perspective. The background, I'll let you look at this slide as I speak to it, because there are many different ways that one could talk about the Chiquitos missions. But essentially, from most scholars' perspectives, and certainly from my own, what's most interesting about them is that they represented the closest to a utopia that was ever found, at least in the Western Hemisphere, between what we call the others and the in-group, meaning, in this case, the others coming from Europe, primarily Spanish and German missionaries, coming and interacting with and living with the natives, who in this case were a collection of 37 different indigenous groups in this area. As a result of this interaction, which actually went quite well on several levels, a unique culture emerged. It's never been replicated. It would be impossible to do so. It still exists in the traditions that they have. If any of you have ever been to the Chiquitanía, especially during Holy Week, Semana Santa, or during Christmas holidays, you can see this on display. In addition to that, there are more tangible legacies, such as the architecture, the art, and in particular the sculpture. As a result, they were declared by the Bolivian government, well, they were first declared World Heritage Sites by the United Nations in 1990. 4 years later, the Bolivian government picked up and decided that they were the first of its now many national patrimonies. The question that arises from all of this is, whose patrimony are these? Who really owns them? And where is the interest in representing the diversity of the stakeholders here? It's not really there, unfortunately, from the standpoint of the Bolivian government. They consider that they, the political entity, the Bolivian government, owns these. Okay? So they determine to what extent they should be developed. They determine to what extent they should be used to represent a past glory. When you go, if you go to any of these villages, you'll see that they're locked in time. So what you're seeing is essentially a late 17th century replication, or rather a replication of a late 17th century village. In fact, these villages existed before and after. Those people who live there now have little or no say, unfortunately, in determining what you see. So in one sense, it's a bit like Disneyland. In the other sense, it's real enough so that you can see the currents when you do go, the tension between those people who are not part of this, those people who, although they're stakeholders, are not recognized, and those who are, who tend to be the elite and tend to be the members of the Bolivian political regime. So it's at best a false distinction, but it's maintained by the Bolivian government, unfortunately. The last 2 questions, do the locals have any say? And if so, which locals? Is best answered by saying there are no locals in terms of those who actually now control these ex-missions. Everyone is considered on parity. However, if you're not with the ruling party and if you're not in favor of what it's doing, it's not likely your voice will be heard, which is quite unfortunate. But it's not a wholly lost scenario. Let me show you a couple of examples. First, there's the church of San Javier. You can see there's cross beams here. These cross beams are from the original church, which was constructed many years ago. Interestingly enough, the inscription on the cross beam says, Anno Domini 1750, Mana Cubo no Manque Apostol San Francisco Javier, which is Chiquitano. This was finished in 1750, referring to the roof of the church, not the church itself, and dedicated to the Apostle St. Francis Xavier, who was not an apostle, but in terms of their cultural perception, he was. In fact, when this church was constructed, there were no Chiquitano living here. The group that were living there at the time, the Piñocas, did not speak Chiquitano, which raises some interesting questions. The church was built, as I said, for the Piñoca, who lived there. It was then built again for the Chiquitano, a group that the Jesuit missionaries brought in. It was then remodeled by mestizo settlers who came after roughly after Bolivia's independence, but actually starting when it was still part of the Spanish Empire. They lived there. They were followed by European missionaries, primarily from Germany, Austria, and Poland, who lived there. But then, interestingly enough, this church, which is the crown jewel of this little town called San Javier, was remodeled between 1987 and 1992 by European architects who did not live there. So the question arises, who had the right to determine how this church looks? And how is it that only outside funding and outside talent was used, when in fact the natives weren't consulted at all? Why is that inscription in Chiquitano and not in, say, Spanish or German or Pinyoka? And again, did anybody ask the locals? And if so, who was asked? So where are all the visitors? Well, they're not there in San Javier, that's for sure. They come once a year, usually during Semana Santa. They go into the church, they take their photographs, they may stay for Mass, they leave. Now, without telling you why this is, I'm going to show you another example. This is the cathedral. It's technically considered a cathedral because it's the seat of the Bishop of Concepcion. Here, the inscription is in Spanish, although it's not a crossbeam, and it says, Casa de Dios y Puerto del Cielo. It's the house of God and the gate of heaven, taken from a verse in Genesis, okay? Look very closely at those figurines. They're unfortunately rather atrocious by any aesthetic standard. And I think it's safe to say that the original inhabitants certainly did not have that idea. Here again, this church was built, in this case, for another group, the Bocaca. The Chiquitano came in afterwards. Once more, the mestizo settlers came. Then again, European missionaries, a second time through. This is because the Jesuits were expelled in 1767. New missionaries, this time Franciscans, came in 1930. Then it was reconstructed, just like the Church of San Javier had been reconstructed, again by Europeans who did not live there and who did not know the culture firsthand. And the same exact questions arise, with one additional one. Where on earth did those creatures come from? Where they came from actually was from a dream. An ex-Jesuit priest who turned architect, his name was Hans Roth, who actually put most of these missions on the map. The reason why they're UNESCO World Heritage Sites today is because of his work. He had a dream. And in his dream, he saw those figures, and he thought, these look like something that should probably be on the outside of a church. Now, there's no historical documentation for that. Very interesting idea. And not what most people would call showing respect to the diversity or the plurality of the culture there, because none of the earlier cultures that had lived in this town had anything to do with them or understood why they were there. Once again, you see the same thing. So where are all the visitors? It's a beautiful little town. If anybody's ever been to Concepcion, it's heaven on earth. It truly is. Yet so few people go. So here are the assumptions that were made and the results that came about as a result of them. Although these development agencies, and there were 5 in particular, had told these towns, you will get all sorts of visitors, your economy will be resurgent, and everything will work out fine for you. In fact, they got very few visitors, and they still to this day have very few. What happened was that the outside experts thought they had all the answers, and there was very little need for them to consult with anybody else, much less the locals who didn't speak their European languages. The second point was that there was so much money thrown around, the assumption became that they could just throw it at some problem, make that problem going away, without examining the roots of the problem. So is it such a good idea to actually take a snapshot of a church as it would have looked in 1750 and leave it at that, without thinking that 200 years ago that town existed, and 200 years later that town still existed? And why then are you focused just on one period of its history? The third issue that arose was that the historical diversity of the towns was not considered. So the Pinyoka, the Bucacas, the Chiquitano, they were excluded. It became more or less an exercise in remembering what Spanish and German missionaries thought the churches looked like and should have looked like for the visitors they hoped to attract. Finally, and this is an important point, there were no ancillary economic ventures, which meant even if you did throw tens of millions of dollars, which is on average each church costs between 12 and 22 million to reconstruct, even if you did that, you're still not supporting these with anything else. So people come, they look at the church, they may be overawed, but they go. And there's nothing to keep them in town. So when all was said and done, here's what happened. The outside experts left under a cloud. They took all the answers with them. There was no technology transfer there. Tens and tens of millions, collectively about $79 million was spent on these 6 churches. It's an enormous sum, especially in the late 70s and early 80s in Bolivia. Over the 35 years of doing so, the inhabitants of these towns, their parishioners in other words, just sunk further into poverty. The townspeople consequently became very disillusioned with the results, and when subsequent development efforts were offered, chose not to participate in them because they were never consulted. These towns, and this is a very sad commentary, these towns are now suffocating because there is no sustainable economic activity. As of last year, they're on the watch list for the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, which means they're in danger of being delisted. Okay, that's not a good thing because this is the only thing they have to hold on to. Out of all of this came a very important lesson. In 2007, I was invited to participate in a conference with the Andean Development Corporation, at which they very magnanimously looked at their role in this project and discovered that there were several failings. Also, as part of that meeting were these other acronyms you see here, the International Development Bank, the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation, USAID, and the Peace Corps. At the end of the day, the subject actually, or rather the report came out the following year. There was one line in particular, that a less aid-dependent approach to development that is more cognizant of local attitudes, cultural diversity, and more collaborative with local catalysts for change. Well, that says two things there. A recognition of the fact that there is diversity and that that diversity needs to be respected, but also that you need to do something more than simply say, we've made a beautiful church or a beautiful museum. You have to somehow support that sustainably. And that is where a new paradigm starts to emerge. The work has to be predicated upon a perceived local need. And the word local is quite important there. The work must be collaborative with local stakeholders. The work must be replicable locally. The work must be scalable locally. And the work must be sustainable locally. Now, there is consensus that these 5 points are now absolutely mandatory for any long-term development effort, especially in a country like Bolivia. 2 new ones have cropped up. They've been percolating since the 80s, and they're now part of, I'm happy to say, most development efforts in eastern Bolivia. One is an acceptance of the diversity of stakeholders, meaning that those who are affected by the development, not just those tangibly involved in it. And 2, there's an understanding that development initiated from the outside, it's okay, it's a good start, but it needs to be replaced by local initiatives as soon as possible. Furthermore, and this is where the work of the Legatum Center, for instance, comes in, that these local initiatives are usually best served by, surprise, entrepreneurs. So why entrepreneurs, who are now incidentally increasingly a larger factor in development work in Latin America? They tend to be local, so they have a vested interest. They understand the culture, its communications, and also the realities on the ground. So they can adapt very quickly, much faster than a foreign aid agency can. They utilize a bottom-up approach in most cases, which in many cases, because it's a resource-constrained environment to begin with, is the only one that works in these areas. They often come from less advantaged backgrounds, and so have an innate understanding of what's needed by the locals. Instead of trying to target their products or services or goods to an audience that may not even exist or that they may not be able to reach locally, they go right to the source, and they know what's needed by the local people. This engenders sustainability in a way that nothing else does. They understand what diversity is because they live with it. They accept it as the norm for the environment in which they operate. So there may be chaos, there may be paradoxes, but these are built into their understandings of the community in which they live and the economic cycles that they create. They don't look for something that's perfectly arranged. They don't look for a monolithic environment. Doing so would be like looking for a needle in a haystack, especially in eastern Bolivia. And they talk to the people and they know their needs. They create viable businesses that fulfill the 5 criteria that the last slide talked about of the new paradigm. And they create local businesses that generate employment, ergo income. And as Martin Fisher put it, income is development. It's not a topic that many people are comfortable with. The notion that you could somehow be helping people by bringing businesses is still, for some people, not ground that they want to tread. However, the evidence, anecdotal and statistical, shows that this is indeed the way to go in Latin America. Now, a happy example. This is also a cathedral. This is in San Ignacio de Velasco. You can see from the larger screen, perhaps, there's a septic system off to the left. It's being dug. The church is restored. Now, admittedly, that tower is a bit out of proportion. Nonetheless, it is a well-restored church. The roads are paved. There's a late model SUV that's there. You can see a radio transmitter tower. There's an internet cafe to the far right. What the Bolivians would call this scenario is bien arreglado, meaning things are really well taken care of. This is a rarity in the Chiquitinilla, and this is the first example of it. So what did they do in San Ignacio? They did something very, very different. Remember, this was the town that did not receive any development funding for 35 years. In their own words, and this comes from an interview I conducted with them last month, they didn't wait for a bailout. They just started small businesses, what we would call micro businesses. They didn't import anything. They worked with what they had, which is basically a knowledge of local resources and needs, right? So they could put two and two together and get four. Thank you. They didn't silo. They talked to each other. They didn't exclude or cater to any one group. They accepted the diversity as a leveling factor in all of their operations. They also, interestingly enough, didn't create or make up names for themselves. They weren't eco-entrepreneurs or social entrepreneurs. They were just entrepreneurs. Between July 2007 and January of this year, that town that we just saw, which again had received no development aid whatsoever, saw 8 locally owned and operated businesses start operations. Now, I visited each one of them. They now collectively employ 88 people full-time, and they generate more than $3 million in revenues on an annualized basis. For Eastern Bolivia, you could put a 0 after that 3 if you want to balance that out. And as an example, so this woman started a plant shop, and underneath her was a lumber exporter. This guy started a carving shop, an eco-resort. Now that did take a considerable amount of money, but it was local. And 2 hotels sprung up in the center of town, moderately priced. All this is going on right now in Eastern Bolivia, in the town of San Ignacio, which was denied any involvement with development activities for the longest time. The lesson, to me, is twofold. One, there was an understanding that diversity was at the core of these communities, and that you couldn't just simply come in and ram through your own ideas of what good development is. 2, they took people that actually lived there. This woman, these 3 people, they got together amongst themselves and said, we're not going to get the help that we think we could get or should get from the outside. So when we're left to our own devices, let's put aside all these things that people tell us about flattening the diversity spectrum, thinking in a homogeneous block, and let's just go for what we know, which is if we start something small that caters to local communities and understands their needs, something will come from it. It is now the most visited and the most prosperous town in all of Eastern Bolivia because of that. And I will conclude with those remarks. Thank you very much.
Again, hold your questions and we'll be back. And I'm going to now introduce our third speaker who came from New York. Wonderful to have you come, Joanne Mariner. She's the director of Hunter College Human Rights Program. And until last December, she worked at Human Rights Watch, most recently as the director of the organization's Terrorism and Counterterrorism Program. Joanne has a graduate degree from Barnard College and received a JD from Yale Law School. She has published widely on human rights issues, conducted advocacy before UN and regional bodies, and appeared on national media such as ABC News, NPR, BBC World, and C-SPAN. She drafted Human Rights Watch 99 submission to the House of Lords in the Pinochet case, and is the author of a groundbreaking 2001 report on prison rape that helped lead to the passage of national legislation to address the problem. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Well, we started with, I think, macro-global understanding. Then we moved to the micro-local. I'm going to pull us back to the macro-global. And my topic today is the functioning of the United Nations, what it's done and what it hasn't done to protect human rights. This story is alternately inspiring and disheartening, but fortunately it's still being written. So a logical starting point is the text of the UN Charter. Drafted with World War II's horrors in mind, the Charter states explicitly that one of the key purposes of the United Nations is, I quote, to achieve international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. These words give hope. But if you were to assume that they reflected a fierce collective desire on the part of the Charter's drafters to tear down the walls of national sovereignty in favor of international protection of human rights, you would be wrong. The strongest powers granted to the United Nations by the Charter, the organization's most compelling and meaningful enforcement powers, were vested in the Security Council to be used only in cases of a threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or act of aggression, language that's clearly meant to evoke interstate conflict, traditional war, not a state's oppression of its own citizens. Moreover, in case the UN's deference to national sovereignty might be questioned, another provision of the Charter states explicitly that nothing contained in the present Charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of a state. You can be sure that authoritarian regimes of all stripes took comfort in this language during the decades that followed the Charter's drafting. But at the drafting stage in San Francisco, there was actually quite a lot of debate over the place of human rights in the Charter and whether human rights even belonged in the Charter. Interestingly, and I think this is also, I mean, the role of the South versus the North is interesting in terms of the role, actually the role of India was important too. But interestingly, a group of South American, Latin American states were quite influential, including Panama, and they pushed to have the Charter include provisions that guaranteed specific human rights. Speaking to the assembled delegations at the very opening of the Charter Conference, the Panamanian representative said, "The Charter must contain an international Bill of Rights. That is to say, a statement of the essential freedoms and rights of the individual, which is, after all, the supreme value of international life and of human relationships." Despite the support of a few delegations, however, this position did not win the day. Latin American states also opposed the Charter's language of encouraging respect for human rights, the language ultimately included in the Charter, in favor of a more demanding reference to protecting or guaranteeing human rights. Yet again, traditional notions of state sovereignty won out. The UK and the US delegations, in particular, said that references to protection or to guarantees would raise the question as to whether or not the organization should actively impose human rights and freedoms within individual countries. As the rapporteur of the drafting committee later reported in his report to the entire conference, the subcommittee held that assuring or protecting human rights is primarily the concern of each state. Given this start, it shouldn't be surprising that at the very first session of the UN Commission on Human Rights in 1947, the Commission determined that it had, I quote, "no power to take any action in regard to any complaints concerning human rights." So a very, I think, restrictive starting point. Fortunately, over time, the UN became bolder in its approach to human rights. Its progress was aided both by developments in standard setting and in institutional structure. In 1948, as you referred to, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted. That was the first part of the International Bill of Rights that Panama had suggested. That was unanimously adopted by the UN General Assembly. The declaration gave weight to the proposition that moral values might be shaped into legally binding norms that are binding on each country and could be enforced by the international community. The two international human rights covenants on civil and political rights and on economic, social, and cultural rights followed in the 1960s. Specific treaties were also drafted to address abuses such as torture, to enumerate the rights of women, and to eliminate racial and ethnic discrimination. The human rights enforcement machinery of the UN began to take shape. Let's fast forward even further. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of communism, the Cold War stalemate that had stopped the UN from taking effective action on many issues ended. The position of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was established in 1994, and after a slow start, it began to gain speed and influence with the appointment of Mary Robinson as High Commissioner. In addition, a number of UN working groups, special mechanisms, and special rapporteurs on human rights issues were established, supported by the High Commissioner's Office, and they issued a number of outstanding reports documenting serious abuses in the years that followed. 1998 saw an enormously ambitious step towards protecting human rights, and one, I think, whose effectiveness is still very much in question. And that is with the convening of the Rome Conference and the drafting of the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. On July 17th, that treaty was adopted by a vote of 120 to 7, with 21 countries abstaining. Notably, the United States was among the 7 countries that voted against the court, primarily because the larger body failed to adopt what the US was advocating, which was a criminal court that was controlled, whose jurisdiction was controlled by the Security Council, of which, of course, the US is a permanent member with a veto power. In 2006, in another, what was hoped to be an important step at least, was the establishment of the Human Rights Council. Because the Council is directly attached to the UN General Assembly, its status is considered higher than that of the Human Rights Commission, its predecessor, which was a functional order of the UN Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC. These changes over the years, while quite welcome, have been far from sufficient. The scope and gravity of today's global human rights problems still far exceeds the capacity of the United Nations institutions to address them. We see this deficit most clearly when the UN struggles to stop mass atrocities, protect the victims of these crimes, and rebuild their countries. The capacity to meet these demands has not kept up with the challenges. I think it's clear that an improved global structure is needed. There are many institutional shortfalls. I think a deficit in capacity, a deficit in funding. But I think the most worrying and profound problem when you look at the United Nations today, which has been highlighted in a number of UN reports, notably the reports that looked at the genocide in Srebrenica and in Rwanda, and that is the lack of national or of human rights-friendly national leadership that guides the organization's actions. It's clear that governments' lack of political will to protect human rights, what one commentator called their half-hearted support for largely ineffective measures, has sapped the UN's promise as an enforcement tool. This was all too clear in the 1990s in Bosnia. David Reef, in his landmark book, I think, about the Bosnian conflict, asserts that the ethnic slaughter that took place there served to expose the impotence and sterility of a system of world order that supposedly was enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. The UN, in his view, served as a handmaiden to the genocide of the Bosnian Muslims. But as one UN official pointed out to him in response, the UN is not the world's government, it is an organization of the world's governments. And in Bosnia for years, the world's governments were unwilling to act to end atrocities. It is the Security Council, that most powerful of the UN's constituent bodies, where we see most clearly this unwillingness of world governments to give priority to human rights. Too often, the Security Council treats human rights as an unwelcome irrelevancy, something best left to specialist agencies in Geneva. It has been far too slow to recognize that human rights abuses are the cause of many conflicts, and that ending abuses is a critical element of fostering and enduring peace. The Security Council's treatment of the Darfur conflict most recently is suggestive of this lack of will. In 2005, after serious atrocities in Darfur had been well documented including by a UN Commission of Inquiry, the Security Council referred the situation in Darfur to the International Criminal Court. As part of its Darfur investigation, the ICC issued arrest warrants for 3 individuals for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. In 2007, it issued warrants for the arrest of Ahmed Haroun, the country's Minister for Humanitarian Affairs and now a state governor, as well as for a Janjaweed militia leader who acted as a proxy militia force for the Sudanese government. In March 2009, the court issued the first of 2 arrest warrants for Sudan's President Omar Bashir. The prosecutor is also pursuing cases against 3 Darfuri rebel leaders for an attack carried out in 2007, which killed 12 UN or African Union peacekeepers. These arrest warrants have not led to action. There's been now 3 years of inaction by Sudan and an absolute refusal to hand over any of these suspects, which has led the ICC prosecutor last April to ask the court to issue a finding, an official finding, of non-cooperation in the execution of the arrest warrants. In May, the ICC made the unprecedented decision to send the finding of non-cooperation of the arrest warrants to the Security Council for the Security Council to take any action it might find appropriate. However, the Council has yet to act. It has a range of options at its disposal, from resolutions to sanctions to presidential statements, but I think for many reasons it has failed to act. The result is that President Bashir travels around Africa with impunity. Even though he should be considered a human rights pariah, officials from other governments rub elbows with him, and at present, his continued flouting of the ICC's warrants, and more importantly, I think the Security Council's indifference to this, threatens to seriously undermine the ICC and weaken the structure of international justice. Do I have time to talk about
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, well, maybe in the question and answer, if people are interested, we can talk about the Human Rights Council, which has also been a disappointment, I think, to a large extent. But just to sum up, I think there's a wide range of reforms that are needed and clearly are under discussion. Reforms to the UN's peacekeeping capacity, reforms to the Secretariat, reforms to the lack of transparency in political processes at the UN. It's really a black box in which the worst kind of horse trading goes on, political manipulation goes on. And most importantly, I think there needs to be change to the problem that I pointed to, the lack of political will. The member states of the United Nations have got to take human rights more seriously and recognize human rights abuses as a core problem that's linked to all the other goals that the UN is trying to pursue: development, peace, a world without, conflict and poverty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you. So we had 3 wonderful presentations. Please come and ask any questions you want. Introduce yourself, give your name and whether you're a student or faculty. Please, and make your question short so everybody gets a chance to answer.
Thank you. My name is Vincent James, an alum, class of 78. One thing that was a common denominator among all your presentations is that diversity is a fairly recent situation that is like 20, 30 years ago just didn't exist. People didn't see a need for it. It also seems like the word diversity could have different meanings depending on the different cultures. And some cultures may even wonder if you even need to have it in the first place, and does the word exist in some cultures? So I'm curious just if you can give some insights to do certain cultures see a need for having that same type of word as it's evolving in the United States, and the challenges that you had to go through it. Some cultures are very long in history, don't see a need to make any changes because things have been working fine for the last few centuries. So just comment on the word and international flavor. Thank you.
Thank you. Nazli, you go in the room.
That's a very interesting question. because as I was thinking about the politics at present time, there are some cultures and some countries where the diversity issue that is so salient as a concept here is simply not relevant, even though observationally there are many different ethnicities and individuals look very different and so forth. I think what is happening is that we're trying to use a common vocabulary that came out of our Western experience that may create some distortions in thinking about diversity. But I think the related part that's important is the question of diversity with respect to what. So, for example, if we look at the Islamic community, it's homogeneous to some extent with respect to fundamental beliefs. It's very, very, very diverse on any socioeconomic, ethnic element. But if you translate that diversity as a diversity in the opportunity to become involved in politics, then all of a sudden the concept takes on a different meaning, and it's a different situation. So I think that's a very important question that was just raised.
Joanne?
Yeah, I mean, I know this is taking me out of my area of professional knowledge, but just as someone who's lived abroad a lot, I think, maybe the word is not used in the same way, but the underlying questions that diversity addresses exists everywhere I've lived. And I've lived in the Middle East, I've lived in Europe, I've lived in Asia. I think, one of the interesting things is diversity has become a value in the United States, and it's a subject of debate, but in many places it's embraced. And what's interesting is in many other countries, diversity is not embraced. You look at the French model, which is to try, you mentioned that in France the approach to colonialism was to try to make everyone French. Well, that is certainly the approach to formerly colonial peoples who've arrived in France and now are part of the population and part of the citizenry. It's to ignore the differences as much as possible between them. And in Germany right now, we're really seeing a huge and very contentious debate between people, political, views of embracing difference, of embracing the Muslim population as different, or trying to make them German. And famously in the Netherlands too, I think now potential immigrants to the Netherlands have to watch a film about the Netherlands, and that sort of very boldly shows Dutch values and homosexuality. And it's kind of a warning, if you come here, you've got to like this, you've got to be like us. So it's a very important debate.
Jeff?
I would add that throughout Latin America, and in particular in countries like Bolivia and Paraguay and some of the other more isolated ones, diversity there is actually very much subjectified. In fact, the word diversidad would probably never be used in the context that we'd use it here. Mm-hmm. People tend to have an understanding very much based along racial lines, not necessarily in a polarizing way, this person is that person, so therefore they're this, but more they're Aymara, and the Aymara do their things and they act their way, and the Quechua do their things and they do their way, and the Guarani do their things their way. It's not to say that they can't be integrated. It's just that to date, an effort has not really been made. So what you see instead are these heterogeneous communities, even in the Chiquitinía, where you might have 6 or 7, or in some rare cases even a dozen or more different groups, living for the most part side by side. It's quite level in most respects. The exception, of course, being the mestizos or the whites from Europe or the United States who've arrived recently. But amongst the indigenous communities themselves, there isn't a whole lot of we're better or these people aren't doing the right thing. It's more of an understanding that there are separate viewpoints that are not necessarily shared, but by the same token are not necessarily antagonistic to each other.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. My name is Alexander Cooper. I'm a graduate student at Department of Nuclear Engineering. Just like first to ask you to forgive me. I'm not an expert in the field, and my question may seem naive, but first I'd like maybe to give some comments and then ask for your advice. Just to come up first to what you're saying in about the history of the post-colonialism era. You mentioned about something like the Holocaust, which is, to my idea, something terrible, but it's also important to mention some also crimes that were committed by the United States. For example, in Japan, there was the drop of the atomic bomb, which is, to my idea, something that triggered the Cold War, this buildup of the nuclear race. And then you reach the point that in '91, there was this collapse of the communism, which is, to my idea, is communism really collapsed in the sense that now the second economical power is ruled by a communist political party, I would say China. So just to be careful about this, and then you mentioned about the human rights. It seems to me always easy to take examples such as Rwanda or ex-Yugoslavia or Timor, but we seldomly talk about what's happening right now in the Gaza Strip or the failure of the United States to prevent the attack against Iraq led by the United States. So I think those questions should also be addressed in the term of human rights failure. Then my question is about diversity. I don't fully understand what you mean by diversity, but my understanding is, and I'll take the example of Egypt, what's happening in Egypt right now. I was very interested in this Bolivia picture, and I was thinking that when we look at the front page of the New York Times, isn't it exactly this well-arranged picture that we see where we show this diversity on the point of view as what should be diversity on our democratic point of view, and in the sense that the democracy or Western democracy tried to use this term of diversity to promote its own interest rather than asking to those people, the diversity, what political system should sustain and do the opposite rather than try to impose our system or enlarge it to diverse people rather than adapt the current system to something that should be diverse.
Do you want to answer?
I'll just quickly respond on the question of human rights, and my references to Darfur and Zimbabwe were not at all meant to imply that those are the only serious human rights problems in the world. And the organization that I belonged to until December, Human Rights Watch, has done, I think, very systematic and serious work on the human rights abuses in Gaza. And in fact, if we were to talk about the UN, which was my subject, the UN has done a lot of work on Gaza. It's sent investigative missions there. And in fact, the UN Human Rights Council, which has, as I was going to discuss, largely been a disappointment, has in fact been very active on Gaza and the Israeli abuses. The problem is that it has been, there's a lack of even-handedness in its work. So while it's been very vocal about abuses in Gaza, it said nothing about Zimbabwe. It said nothing about the recent protests in Tunisia and Egypt. So it casts doubt on the motivations of the council. But at any rate, no, I agree with you. There are, Gaza, Guantanamo, there are serious abuses committed by Western governments. It's not just Zimbabwe.
Can I follow up
Nazli.
on this? I think what you say is accurate, but remember the discussion here is not primarily on the subject of implementing foreign policy that supports norms that we believe in. Second, we have to recognize that there are dominant national interests that can be pursued and are pursued if one has the tools to pursue them that are violently opposed to human rights, et cetera, et cetera. But the third thing that is important is that I cannot imagine any leader of any country at any point in time in the last, from today to on, to stand up and say, I am against human rights, I am for my national interest. He or she may really believe it or want it or deploy the troops along those lines, but the norm is no longer acceptable. And it takes time for norms to be implementable.
Leon.
On the previous question and on this one, it matters a great deal to how much stress a given community is subjected. And respect for diversity in the normal day-to-day business may last for a long time, and if the stress is intense enough, it may break down. One example of this is the collapse of respect for diversity in Yugoslavia after Tito died. Old antagonisms which had been kept under control bubbled up again. In some sense, I think the situation in Uganda had some similarity with this. So diversity is a delicate flower, and it behooves the people who set public opinion to respect it and to approve of it, and it takes a very long time for it to grow and to be fully established. It is not only a question of what formal legal arrangements are proposed to protect diversity. There is a great necessity for the diverse people who live in what is ostensibly the same community to respect and tolerate each other, even in the presence of substantial stress.
Let me just add, because you mentioned my comments. I mean, I was referring to the 1940s, not so much just to highlight the Holocaust, though I think that had a huge impact on the resolution for the United Nations. But I was trying to say that why we thought at that time that everybody is somewhat equal. And that in that way, the war after what happened in Japan, I mean, it was reinforced the idea. Because if you look at American foreign aid, that went to Germany and Japan both, if you read it carefully, it's very much talks about how that will be all democratic countries, just like any of us, right? What I'm struck by in the diversity conversation is in the 50s, the only discussion of diversity was class, which we somehow don't mention anymore. Somehow it doesn't, as if it doesn't exist. It does exist. Class differences does exist. But by the 70s, when we were struggling with what's happening in developing countries, we realized that class differences alone couldn't explain what was going on. So a lot of other things were leading to people disagreeing with the national government, which actually Nazli laid out, the national scheme to get this one nation. So it began to look at other variables other than class. And I think that's kind of interesting. It opens the whole debate.
Can I follow up on this? In the United States, we don't use class as a distinguishing feature in normal day-to-day discourse. In fact, it's bad manners to raise the issue of class. But if we look at income differentials, the income differentials are really there, and they're growing. Now, do we call that class, or we call it something else? We homogenize the concept by calling it income differentials, not class.
Please.
Hello, my name's Dorothea Klein. I'm from the University of London and currently at the Berkman Center over at Harvard. I was really intrigued by the different perspectives that we got, and I just would like to continue the conversation by following up on these ideas that are in the room around language and discourse. And I mean, for starters, just as a slight provocation, I'd kind of say, I really like the weavings up there, but why are we calling it a world stage? And what are we implying with that kind of word? You know, the world stage is essentially made up of individual places, and any place that's inhabited is someone's home. And I wouldn't like my home to be called part of the world stage, because that might imply that other people are taking some kind of responsibility for it, when actually this is something that's kind of joined up and should be very much also in the hand of local people. So I think there's an interesting story here about the world, the global, and the local. But that's a sort of just an example of sort of the discursive frames that we're using. And I thought that was interesting. We had discussions around the international community. We had some of these grand narratives of development. And I was actually wondering whether we're now at a place and time, given the changes in our media, given that at the moment, for example, journalists are very confused by social media, Twitter, et cetera, where our media is becoming more fragmented and the stories are becoming more fragmented, and whether we're now at a space where we're confronted, whether we want to or not, with multiple narratives, where the grand narratives are even less valid anymore, and whether we actually have to think a lot more in diverse stories and narratives that may not quite sort of confluate in the same way. And I'd like to invite you to kind of think about maybe this window of opportunity that we have at the moment to step away from grand narratives or even narratives as academics that we like to tell about a particular development or a particular story. Maybe something to work with.
This is very interesting because the work that I'm doing now, which is a collaboration between MIT and Harvard, has to do with the impact and the implication of cyberspace, which reinforces several things. One is the diversity of narratives and the possibility of expression. But for me, I think the most important thing is the visualization, the ability to see people rioting, dictators abdicating, whatever one does, and it's not filtered through the New York Times or filtered through Le Monde. You can always pick those newspapers up, but you have the possibility of access to a variety of different perspectives and views. Now, it is true that most countries allow and disallow some views and some sources of communication. So I don't want to give the impression that all is open now, but there's more transparency now than there ever was before. Now, this may not say a lot, but still, it's something.
John, do you have
I don't know if I have anything to say.
Jeff?
No, I suppose I take the attitude, actually, that all the world's a stage. Like it or not, it is. It's really a matter of perception. You can fragment it, you can make it as small as you like, but I think it's doing a great disservice to humanity to assume that we don't have global themes. We certainly do, and we've talked about them here tonight, the pursuit of human rights themselves, the pursuit of freedom and liberty. I mean, if you go back to 111 years ago on January 1st, the year 1900, how did the majority of people in the world, not just in the United States or in the Western Hemisphere, how did the majority of the people in the world spend their day? No, I don't know who came up with this, but I found it fascinating that the majority of them had resolutions and they spent the day in prayer. That to me is fascinating. That the majority of the Earth's population, presumably, did this. Now, I'd consider that a grand theme. Now, on February 6th, we had the Super Bowl, and I suppose you could say the majority of the world's people watched that. I somehow think that that's far less of a grand theme than prayer. So I guess I would take the viewpoint, and I'm sorry to sound so antagonistic, that these grand themes do exist, and there's no shame at all to call them out.
How you want to take? Well, yes, please.
Hi, good evening. My name is Sarah Ting. I first of all want to thank you for the wonderful presentation here and all the information that you've provided us with. I head up an organization called World Unity, and we are working on a grand theme. We want to eliminate all forms of prejudice, biases, and discrimination, not just locally, but in the world. And how do we plan to do it? With a very simple poem that says, "Are you greater than the sun that shines on everyone? Black, brown, yellow, red, and white, the sun does not discriminate." I want to begin my question with a quote by Albert Einstein. He said, "You cannot solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. You must stand on a higher ground. So my question is, what quality do you think is needed in leadership for that consciousness? And what role do you believe education plays in producing those leaders?
Thank you. That's a wonderful
This is for you,
question.
Leon. Yeah.
I think in the final analysis, the respect for diversity, the wholehearted acceptance of diversity used to be a religious thought. We are all equally children of the same God, or some wording of this sort. And to some degree, that approach to the problem, to the issue, has decreased as the amount of real deep concern with religious issues has weakened, and as Jeffrey pointed out, we don't go to church necessarily, we watch the Super Bowl. So we substitute we need to substitute another fundamental rationale for accepting diversity. One of them may be that not to accept it is utterly destructive, and this is a sort of utilitarian reason for respecting diversity. But I think basically the notion of brotherhood remains essential, and apart from religious considerations, I think it is biologically wired into us. And the role of education is to try to bring this out and to think more in terms of community needs and somewhat less in terms of personal advantage.
Do you want to add?
I just was thinking about your question in terms of educating leaders, and I was thinking it in a very parochial, really micro level, which is what do I think I'm doing in my department as I teach? This is not the Kennedy School, so I don't think when I go into class or do research or supervise thesis that I'm trying to educate the next leaders, but I'm seriously thinking about educating, providing knowledge and revising my own knowledge with respect to transmitting to the next generation a better set of knowledge content that I have received. So I think there may be, in some cases, the leadership and the knowledge generation functions may be one, but in this very micro example, the emphasis that I would place is on the knowledge side. If you were to ask the same question at the Kennedy School or maybe the Sloan School here, the answer would be much more weighted probably on the leadership side of the education system. But you asked what would make a good leader.
I would add, unless Jeff, you want to say something, I think it's very important to understand unequal opportunities of different groups, of very different groups. And I think that if we start from the premise that everybody is equal and are capable of doing incredibly interesting things as human beings, which is being discussed in philosophy, as you know, that sense work that's got a Nobel Prize for. We also have to explain to the students why everybody cannot do that at the current moment. And what are the different ways that their capabilities are being constrained, and to what extent social policies, human action is needed to create a level playing field. I think that's very important sensibility to give. Thank you. Yes, please.
Robin Pringle. I'm part of the administrative support staff at MIT currently. My questions come, though, from years of experience in educational program design and development, professional experience and personal experience of living in a rural community that was a focus of economic development efforts. And the first question is, in considering this transition to new development practices that are more collaborative, promoting more local participation and use of local resources, how can we protect the authenticity of those processes? And related to that, in this time when there's growing interest in universities in involving students in community service, how can we help them engage in a way that is respectful of the authenticity of those processes? And I think the question arises sometimes, community service in the service of whom? I've had conversations actually with some Humphreys Fellows who wrestle with those tensions of the needs and interests of the communities and places they're working with, and issues of engaging students in those processes in a way that really is serving the needs of the community as well as the needs of the student. And it doesn't mean that the needs of the students to progress, to succeed, to advance their careers aren't legitimate, but the question is, how can we, especially at MIT, I think we have so many people here who have a lot of experience, as has been represented tonight, and we also have a lot of people who are interested in engaging in those experiences. So perhaps there are efforts already going on that I don't know about, or is there a way that we might begin to build some collective wisdom around that? Just to give a little bit more of an example of the concern for protecting the authenticity of the processes, in my rural development efforts, quite often we had people coming in who were schooled in these ideas and almost had a sort of sanctity about the notion of the process that sometimes kept them from hearing somebody who maybe wasn't familiar with process but was very passionate and had very legitimate experience. Sometimes we had, participation meant selecting from pre-selected multiple items in an auditorium where the conversation was very stifled, but people would stand in the rain for hours afterwards by their cars talking about what really mattered. So, and I've heard other stories from international development efforts where similar things happen, and then there's a growing cynicism in the community. So I laud those efforts, and I wonder how we can build a more skilled approach to doing that.
Thank you. Would you like to answer?
Well, I'd say two things at the onset, and here's where I actually will take the liberty of saying a little bit about what's going on in Mexico right now, because it falls very closely along the lines of your concerns. The depth of individuality for each project is directly proportional to the amount of people involved in it, right? And so even the largest communities have this incredible diversity within them. It's never the case, unfortunately, that there is a perfect paradigm that works. The one that I discussed, it was literally the result of 35 years of back and forth fighting. But stripping away consensus and stripping away paradigmatic expressions that you can put into a PowerPoint, I think it comes down to three things, really. And not to be overly simplistic about it, but one, there needs to be an inherent understanding that you'll never get it straight. It's just simply the reality of life. I have been told by many people whose opinions I respect that perhaps I know more about Eastern Bolivia than anyone else alive. That may be true in the Western world. That's certainly not true when you get down to the level of the Chiquitanía. So there's a certain humility that has to be, I think, a dominant factor whenever you're discussing these things, which is that you'll never know it from the way they do unless you happen to be one of them. A second point is that we often lose sight of the fact that what we think they want may not be what they want. The photograph of San Ignacio is a perfect example. I happen to find that church hideous. They don't. They like it that way. They like that huge concrete structure. Now, no one could have predicted that, and that took several years to realize that that's what they wanted. And I think the third factor, when considering how to preserve the authenticity of these practices or these processes, is, like it or not, and this is very much where Mexico comes in La Vaquita in particular, you have to immerse yourself at a level at which you are capable of doing two things: acting with them and in full concert with them, even when it comes to doing things that perhaps you think serve no purpose at all, and at the same time being willing to give it up when it's time to go. It's a little bit like being a midwife. It's not your project. You are invited into it. It's going to go on after you leave, most likely. But you have to learn to let it go and say, this is really all that was wanted. I make one exception to that rule. If it's a medical practice, that's very different. In La Vaquita, for instance, we do see high incidences of diabetes and other diseases that are treatable. The people there don't know how to handle that. We do, and so we are a bit more adamant that they adopt a certain process that we've determined will work, and we know it does. But if they come to us and they say, as they did to this group that came in January, you've arrived on the day of Epiphany, and all of you, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, atheist, you're all going to go to the church with us and watch baby Jesus wake up, which was the literal interpretation one student gave me. That's what you will do. If you are not immersed in that experience, and if you're not capable of understanding why that experience is as important to them as it is, no development project will ever work. There's ample history, unfortunately, of people throwing, again, millions of dollars at things, only to discover later on there's usually a much simpler process. And I would close with one comment that actually Dr. Harris asked some months ago. Is development work orthogonal to protecting the diversity within, or to protecting these communities? To some extent it is, because there's always the intrusion or entrance of the other, right? And the other is always going to put some sort of pressure, real or excuse me, it's always real, but there's going to be some sort of pressure, desired or not, on the host community. So I don't think it's ever a perfect fit. I've yet to see an example.
I would say, though, from having been involved in a community and development, that we certainly needed experts, and it was too bad that cynicism had built up over the years. There were definitely places where we needed expertise and we needed intervention, and so my concern is to build a growing body of wisdom of how to make that work.
I would say that what your comments spurred on made me think about this book by Anthony Appiah on contamination.
Oh, yes.
I think it's interesting, and it goes back to the earlier question on local versus global and why we are making this global a big issue.
Yes.
I think that this idea of purity and authenticity, I think we have to be careful about that in the larger historical span of things, as to the way things have been intermixed for good or bad reason. And many times, though, when you look at what we consider authentic, actually is very mixed.
Yes.
And I think that in the name of purity, terrible things have been done.
I should make a distinction here. What I meant about authenticity is making a process authentically collaborative, not talking about the authenticity of a community or a particular culture, but how to make a process legitimately collaborative and not something that's still being engineered from above.
Well, that does go to the La Vaquita experiment, where we do insist that the students participate from the minute they arrive. If they get up at 4 in the morning and take a shower because that's when the natives do, that's what they do. If they decide that they're going to stay up until 2 in the morning to celebrate their patronal feast day, the students do the same thing. And that does protect the authenticity, because the collaboration becomes very real. They understand from a first-person perspective. I lived through this. Yes. I now see through their eyes, however short it may be, that this is why this is important to them.
We have time for one last question. Please.
Hi, I'm Nell Miaski. I'm a freshman here, and I'm thinking about being a political science major, but we'll see. So my question is actually with regard to something that, I don't know if you're familiar with the Terrascope program at MIT, but it's essentially a program where every year for the first semester and sometimes the second semester, students engage in trying to solve a very big problem that probably can't be solved. And this year it was solving world hunger in like 4 months, which was interesting. But what we came across in our research time and time again is very similar to what you've been saying here, which was twofold. Number one, the UN had done a lot of things incorrectly and poured a lot of money into doing things incorrectly. And secondly, this bottom-up approach that seems to be at the root of the most successful programs was time and time again ignored. Or they said they were doing it, but it happened for 2 weeks, and then the people on top took over. So I guess my question is, as much as we say that we have to fix the UN and we have to look for a bottom-up approach, I don't exactly understand how you change a system that's grown up like this to have such a top-down approach that's financed by corporations and governments that have their own interests. How do you make that system something that deals from the bottom up and doesn't make the same mistakes as it has been for the past 50, 60 years?
Do you want to try?
It's really out of my area of expertise on the UN.
It's problematic because the members of the United Nations are states. The funds, for the most part so far, have come from states. Now, many UN agencies are trying to diversify their funding so that it comes from the private sector, which substitutes one set of interests for another set of interests. And so I do understand the dilemma and the challenge, but before we begin talking about strategies to fix something that must be fixed, there's also the other side of it. And this is time and again we've seen that it's the UN agencies, whether it's UNDP or UNESCO or any of the others, that have taken a much more corrective measures in their development program that governments would not have really supported. And in the articulation or trying to implement the strategies towards sustainability, however vague this might be, it's the UN agencies that are really pushing, not the national governments. So I don't want to defend the UN at all, but I do want to say that a fair assessment is needed, and I have no idea how to do that. Maybe you do.
Let me just add that because we do this work in our department, in urban planning, looking at bottom-up strategies, what I'm struck by, if you take one strategy, let's say microenterprise that emerged from these communities, the small businesses that they need to survive. I mean, the cases where it has expanded, it's not just bottom-up, because in scaling up and the kind of issues that Jeff was raising, it is often some institutions at the top that comes and works with the institutions at the bottom. It doesn't happen all the time. But I think making the dichotomy either is top-down or bottom-up doesn't allow us to see the connections that are necessary for broad-based development. Well, we have to end. But I want to thank all of you and the speakers for the presentations, and all of you for your wonderful questions. And this is, hopefully, it's just the beginning. It's a second session. There will be more sessions. But thank you all for coming, and have a good evening.